Thorne. I'm one of the Associate Directors for Wellbeing Resilience here at Civil Service College, and I am absolutely thrilled to introduce you to Wendy Williams, who's joined us here today. Thank you, Wendy, for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, so we've just been having a backstage conversation about lots of exciting things. So before we get started, this is a live conversation. As I said, this is our fourth time we've done this. We've been shaking up the usual webinars for something a bit more interactive and a bit more interesting, and we've had such lovely feedback from those of you who've joined our previous live conversations. So I'm thrilled to see more than 70 of you joining us today from all around the civil service and the public sector. So big thank you. If you've not joined one of these before, please feel free to put your cameras on. It's quite nice for us to actually see people's faces, isn't it, rather than feeling like we're just talking to the screen. And if you have, oh, there we go, and now everyone's put their screens on.
Thank you.
Oh, it's so lovely. It's so, honestly, as someone on the other end, it's so much lovelier. And now we can see all these lovely faces coming on.
Great.
Absolutely fabulous. I know we've got people joining us from Malaysia and other beautiful parts of the world. So for the conversation, if you can keep your cameras on if you want to, but keep your mics muted, we'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions during the session. Just pop them in the chat, any questions you've got for us. I'll keep an eye on that during the conversation, and then if we have time we can do a bit of a live Q&A with Wendy as well. So fantastic, we've almost got 80 people. This is fabulous. So today we are talking all about how we succeed by working with others. So this is all about trusting our own potential and really the power of collaboration. So Wendy, if it's okay with you, I'd love you to just introduce yourself properly to our audience here today, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty of collaboration.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Cass, and it's great to be here with you and to join so many of you. Thank you for taking the time. If I introduce myself briefly, I'm a solicitor by profession. I've just completed, in fact, I'm just coming up for completing my 32nd consecutive year as a practicing solicitor. Oh my goodness me, it's so scary. Because it means I'm not 25, which is what I usually tell people. But I'm a solicitor by profession. I've worked in all three sectors. I started out life volunteering at a law centre. Then I went to the opposite extreme and went into private practice. And I worked for a small firm in London, and we did criminal law and childcare law. And I loved that. I was eventually made a partner. And then, as my defence friends would say, I crossed over to the dark side, because then after a period in the CPS Inspectorate, I actually joined the Crown Prosecution Service. And for those of you who don't know, that's the National Prosecuting Authority in England and Wales. So I joined them. I joined at a pretty senior level. And oh my goodness me, that was a real baptism of fire. But I managed to sort of make my way through, and ultimately I was promoted and became a Chief Crown Prosecutor. And that's when I moved to the Northeast, because the Northeast was my region. So I was responsible for prosecutions in Northumbria, Durham and Cleveland, and just loved it, absolutely loved the job. But then I was told about the job that I currently do.
Okay.
So in fact, the person who gave me my first job in the CPS, she and I eventually became peers, and we've known each other for 20 odd years. In fact, I met her this week,
fantastic.
And we've kept in touch. And she was doing my current job, and she contacted me to say she'd been seconded to do a public inquiry, and so there was a vacancy, and she said you might want to apply for it. So I'd always thought, I actually thought, should I bump her off? Because I actually really wanted her job and thought this would be my dream job. But I didn't bump her off. She was seconded. I applied for the role. I really, really worked hard, went through the selection process. My goodness me, they actually appointed me, and I've been doing the job ever since. So I've been doing this role for 8 years. Coming up for my 9th year, and it's great. I inspect the police, I inspect the fire service, and you really get the sense that you're hopefully making a difference. And then, as if that wasn't enough, I was asked in 2018 by the then Home Secretary to carry out a review into what became known as the Windrush scandal.
Yes, that's right.
And I was asked to find out what went wrong, why it went wrong, and what needed to change to avoid something similar happening again. I did that, but I did that alongside my current role.
Wow.
So yes, they allowed me to scale back. They said I should spend 40% of my time on my usual role, my inspectorate role, and 60% on Windrush. It didn't work out that way, but I think that's one of the true tests of teamwork and collaboration, because it was as a result of the support of my colleagues at the inspectorate that I was able to inspect and to carry on doing that, while also doing what was a really, really tough review. And I merged relatively unscathed. I mean, hopefully the camera isn't too close and you can't see all these grey hairs that I've managed to accumulate, because, as I say, I am actually 25, but it's as a result of the hard professional life that I've had that I've got these grey hairs. But I was really privileged to do it. And having completed the review, as I did in 2020, I did an update. I was asked by the then Home Secretary to do a progress update. I did that, published that report in 2022, so March of last year. And then finally, I went back to the inspectorate role full time, where I've been ever since. And I do other things which we might come on to, but yes, that is my career in a very large nutshell.
Yeah, well, I don't know about you joining, but I feel extremely honoured to have you with us today, Wendy. And I know we can all learn so much from you. And I bet you're quite glad now that you're just doing your role and not that very big extra piece of work. Although, as you say, I'm sure that gave you a lot of insight into the power of collaboration.
Yes, it did.
I think we could kick this off with a very interesting angle that we were talking about just before we went live. Obviously, we were talking backstage about how the world has changed, the way we work has changed, hasn't it, in the last few years? And obviously at Civil Service College, we work with a wide range of public sector bodies and civil service organisations. And one of the things that we have also noticed is the big challenges, but also the opportunities that people face with hybrid working.
Yes.
So perhaps we could start with that. We know that when people work in teams, it can really, really foster so much growth, create inspiration, that connectedness, never mind the objectives you can achieve. But what are the sort of challenges in a post-pandemic world, do you think? What's been your experience?
Well, I think I can compare and contrast, because if I take Windrush as an example, I carried out the work between 2018 and March of 2020.
Okay.
That's when my report was published. Not that the date is indelibly printed on my brain, but that was actually the week before we went into lockdown.
Interesting.
So, having worked on the review for over 18 months, I was very much working with the team in person, and we were carrying out all sorts of roles. And we can perhaps come on to some of the teamwork issues that presented themselves, which I'm quite happy to do. But in answer to your question about hybrid working, when I was asked to do the progress update, that was in September of 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So we had come out of lockdown, but there was still the practice of hybrid working. And the most marked difference was in how you establish that team ethos. Now, what we did do was, wherever possible, we met in person. And I do think that establishing a connection with people face to face when you're working closely with them is absolutely key. But then it becomes a question of just trusting people.
Yes, yeah.
And being prepared to meet at all sorts of weird and wonderful times in all sorts of odd circumstances. And I think that point about trust and confidence really comes to the fore, because both teams each time were absolutely fantastic. They were working very differently on the two projects, but the hybrid team were no less committed than the in-person team, if I can put it that way. And I think it tests you, hybrid working tests you as the leader, because I can only think of one or two occasions where I've come across people who weren't committed to doing the best possible job that they could do. Overwhelmingly, and this has been said to me and it has been proven by me, people come to work, and particularly in public service, to do the best job that they can do.
Yeah.
So the commitment is beyond doubt. And I think that if that's your starting point, and if you make it clear to people, this is the endeavour, this is what we're trying to achieve, I need your help to assist me in achieving that objective, people more often than not, they want to help, they want to do the best that they can and do right by whatever it is that you've asked them to do. But some strange practices have now, sort of crept in, because what we do find is that, hybrid working offers all sorts of opportunities. And in many ways, you can be even more sociable if you're meeting people online, because in any given day, you could have any number of meetings with any number of different configurations.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so that brings with it flexibility and also that added dimension when it comes to social interaction. So it is actually a more socialised workplace in some ways, but I do think that in other ways it's less so, because of course if you're operating from your study, your kitchen, your home, and if you're operating online, sometimes it isn't, the spontaneity might not be there, that ability to really establish that bond and that enthusiasm and really generate a positive atmosphere. It is more difficult. It's not impossible, but it's more challenging. So I do think that hybrid working offers all sorts of opportunities, not least flexibility, because you can meet at weird and wonderful times. You can, do your chores, but work at a time to suit you and complete the task. But it's the extent to which those relationships that you form, those working relationships around the so-called water cooler, it's the extent to which those opportunities are lessened. That's what I think is the biggest difference. And especially now that I'm looking back over so much of my career, given that so much of it has been spent in that sort of in-person environment, I do see some of those changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was sharing with you before we went live about how I was at an organisation yesterday and we ran an in-person event, and there were 52 people in the room, and something that I think you don't often see in the same way when you're doing things virtually or even in hybrid is that energy.
Yes.
The energy I can't even describe it to you. It was infectious. People were the energy was kind of bouncing off the walls. Everybody left that session, and then the conversations continued when they went to get their coffees and their lunches, and some people went outside. And but that's not to say, because I have also experienced some some virtual occasions where I've also felt a similar energy. But interestingly, we also saw it in this conversation when some of you suddenly switched your cameras on. You could see I could feel a shift in the energy in this room. That's true. And I can see Carol Ann agreeing with us. And I can actually see her facial expression because she's got her camera on. And I think maybe we can just touch on that subject, because I think it's something that all of us have experienced. I can see nearly 100 people now joining us live, Wendy, which is fantastic. How easy is it to succeed working with others when we don't have a uniformed culture of how we work together when we're not in person? So we were talking as well backstage about when you're there's certain etiquette when we were in person together, although even some of those rules and boundaries and social norms have become slightly blurred. But when we are working together remotely, how do we ensure that we can get the best out of people? What's been your experience with this sort of cameras on, cameras off, and different sort of boundaries with that?
Well, that's the interesting thing, Kat, because there are so many similarities in terms of the, shall we say, quote unquote, traditional way of working that do read across, do transfer into the more recent and received way of working. And some of those commonalities are being very clear about the mission. I mean, I probably shouldn't say this, but I used to go to leadership events and people would talk about, having a vision and having values and, being very clear about their purpose. And I must admit, I was a bit cynical. I was a bit skeptical about this vision thing. But it is so true. And if I can use any number of examples, but I would like to use the Windrush example.
Absolutely.
Because that was a review of the Home Office and its handling of a particular set of circumstances that went wrong. And I was given a Home Office team to help me carry out the review. Now, I did bring to the endeavour a few people myself who I'd worked with previously, or colleagues with whom I was working at the time. So I had my own sort of mini team.
Okay.
But the wider team was, overwhelmingly comprised of Home Office staff. Now, bearing in mind, this was a review about failings in the Home Office. You can readily accept and understand that some people might have had conflicting loyalties. There might have been a sense of, well, let's sort of try and run interference so that she doesn't really get to the bottom of things, out of an understandable sense of loyalty to the department. That didn't happen, however. And I think the reason for that was that I was absolutely clear from the outset that I wanted to get to the bottom of what had gone wrong, not for any other reason than for the benefit of the people who had suffered the injustice.
Absolutely.
And because I was so clear about that, and it wasn't a question of me going into it with preconceived ideas, because I genuinely didn't have any. The only thing that I was clear about was that it was a tragedy. Other than that, nothing else. And because I was open to any possibilities, but because I rooted the review in trying to explore the experiences of those who'd suffered, that I think was at the heart of it. So to give you an example, we ran a series of road shows where I asked people to just pitch up and tell me what had happened to them. And I remember at the very first road show, there were probably about 50 people at this event, one of whom was a man in his 50s. He'd, as a result of the scandal, he'd lost his home, lost his job, lost access to healthcare, and at the time he was estranged from his family and he'd been removed from the UK. They'd managed to get him back, but he was virtually destitute, and I saw a grown man cry. Now, the point was that I brought members of the team to the road shows so that they could hear the first-hand accounts of people who'd been affected, and it just switched on a light for them, because there was that sense of that shared purpose, that shared objective. You know, we want to do right by everyone, including the people who've been affected, but also including the members of staff at the Home Office. And that was the other thing that came out of it, my immense respect for the civil servants who worked at the Home Office. So the point is that whether in a hybrid situation or whether you're not, if you're very clear about what it is that you want to achieve, if you make it clear to those with whom you're working that, you know, this is what we want to do, I need your help to assist in achieving that, then I actually think that that serves to, you know, really enable people to get behind what you want to do. But this is very much, I mean, it's a team endeavour. I can't think of many, if any, scenarios where people can work in isolation and they can achieve everything. Yes, so it's the importance of the team that really comes to the fore.
And I think that your example is very powerful, and I think what's very important is that I think we can all be guilty, whether we're leaders or whatever roles we're performing in the sector, that we can realise we need to involve people later, and then it's difficult to get the same level of engagement, isn't it?
Yes.
Because it sort of comes, the way it's communicated can come across slightly differently. And I think whether it's about encouraging people to have their cameras on in meetings and things, it's, as you say, it's so critical to be really clear about why is this important, and I think that is something that will really help a lot of people to collaborate more effectively with their teams in whatever it is that they're doing.
That's right, but I think it's important to recognise that you can't, and I'm saying this from personal experience. If I look back over my career, there was certainly a period of time when I felt that, I mean, apart from anything else, I felt that whenever I was offered an opportunity, whenever I applied for a job and I was successful, I always felt this huge sense of personal responsibility, because, you know, I felt, well, you're on display,
yes,
and people are looking to you, and they're looking to see how you carry out your role, how you conduct yourself, and so I always felt that sense of personal responsibility. However, the risk was that I kind of felt, right, I'm a perfectionist and it's got to be done. It's got to be done just like this. And, you know, and because of that, for so much of my career, I didn't necessarily reach out, I hate that term, but I didn't necessarily engage with others. And I wasn't necessarily a team player. And it was only as a result of experience that I recognised a couple of things. The first was that if I think that I'm the only person who's got all the ideas, oh gosh, we are really in trouble. Do we really have a problem?
Yeah.
So I don't have the monopoly on good ideas, quite the reverse. Where I really thrive is in a situation where everyone feels they're contributing and you're bouncing ideas off of one another. And I developed a saying, which was, I'm never too proud to cadge, because, you know, if somebody had an idea, I would say, yes, that's an excellent idea, and I think I'll take it as my own, and, you know, sort of make a joke of it. But, you know, you really did benefit from the experiences, the views, and just the thoughts of others. That was the first thing, no person's an island. But the second was, it's practically impossible for you to operate in isolation if you are really serious about wanting to succeed. Absolutely. In whatever the objective, you know, whatever the objective is, you can't do it on your own. So the moment I realised that and recognised the richness that call it diversity, call it, you know, variability, whatever, that difference that mixed teams, mixed disciplinary teams, and also mixed ways of working could bring, that's when things really started to happen. And in the latter period of my career, I have been fortunate enough to be in these leadership positions, and therefore to be able to recruit and hopefully develop and hopefully encourage and mentor and coach. And what I always say is that any leader has the responsibility to surround themselves with people who look, think, and work differently to them. And that's something that I've tried to do. So if you look at some of the appointments that I've made, they probably raised a bit of an eyebrow, but boy, have I enjoyed working with really different people.
It's so interesting, all of those points, and it reminds me of before I started working with CSE and running my own organisation, I was a CEO of actually a Commonwealth charity. And I remember working with a coach in the US, and I talked to her about, and anyone who's listened to these in conversations knows how very, very honest I am, because I think it's really important to share when you have felt, you know, spouts of imposter syndrome and things like that. And as my very first appointment of CEO, I remember one of my colleagues getting a really big financial grant and feeling very uncomfortable about it because it wasn't me who had done it. And I remember talking to my coach about it and saying, well, she's overstepped the mark. This isn't her job. You know, her job is to deliver the programs. And she said, your job is to lead the organization to achieve its objectives and to enable your team to fulfill those objectives. Absolutely. And I thought, wow, she's right. But I found it very difficult to not have that constant feeling of, this is such a big, as you say, feeling that personal responsibility that's all on my shoulders because I've got the title, I've got the responsibility. And invariably in a lot of senior roles, you also have the benefits that come along with those. So you sort of feel like you need to be the one who's working the extra hours and displaying and showing everybody.
Absolutely. And I do remember in my last but one role, I remember saying to someone, I will be the first person in the office in the morning and I will be the last person to leave the office at night. And they looked at me and said, so what's the what's the reason for that?
Yes.
And I thought, oh, well, I thought, I would be demonstrating that I was absolutely committed.
Yeah.
And it was an object lesson in not losing sight of what it is that you're there to do and being very clear about your role. And your point about just being prepared to delegate, I think you're right. When you get into senior positions, you are very fortunate, but with that position comes responsibility. And I think there is a responsibility, firstly, to trust your team, and secondly, to empower your team. And if you either don't trust them or empower them sufficiently, then you're not really helping them to do the best that they can. And that's why that perfectionism that I spoke about, I had to sort of ditch that. I had to ditch the sense that, only I could do this and I really needed to take that responsibility on my shoulders. But also I had to provide sufficient support so as to empower members of the team to do what they needed to do. And that's where things like, what is the culture that you inculcate? What sort of culture do you establish? What culture do you nurture in the workplace and in those working relationships? Because if people don't feel trusted and if they don't feel empowered, then if, God forbid, something happens that shouldn't, they're not going to come and tell you. So it's how do you create that atmosphere where somebody said, it's about making it okay to fail, and somebody else in the meeting said, oh no, I don't agree with that.
Really?
But I understand what the person meant. How do you create that atmosphere where somebody can just say, Wendy, I got it wrong here.
Yeah.
Because if that's the case, then at least you know what the issue is, and you can say, okay, what do we need to do? And you can identify, hopefully, a solution with the person on board. But without that trust, without that empowerment, you can forget it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Paul Wiley, who was on our live in conversation with, talked about, he had a very public campaign of failure. And he talks very candidly and very open about it, and the fact that him and his team got it wrong, but it was very difficult for them to admit that being so public. And I think it is difficult, isn't it? And I think that there's still a lot of stigma in the workplace that we need to get it right, and if we get it wrong, we sort of almost cover it up and move on swiftly.
And actually on that subject, I was thinking about the concept of the team, but in the context of the civil service, because at the moment, it is really, really challenging in public service. And so teamwork, it couldn't be more essential. And I was thinking of the different government departments, and I actually think that ministers are part of the team. So it's, how do officials support ministers? How do they manage upwards? How do they help create that atmosphere where you can bring issues to the table, but you're seen as part of the solution, not part of the problem. So I think it is a dual responsibility which we all have to try to contribute to that team ethos where it is okay to say, I'm really not sure how this is going to go, or I'm not sure I got it right there. Do you think I could have maybe done things differently? And know that you can do that in a collegiate environment, as opposed to perhaps worrying that something might happen. So I think just remembering that the team extends, it extends well beyond whatever the specific responsibilities are that you might have, and just thinking of the ripple effect outwards and how you can be, one of those positive influences around the environment that surrounds you.
Absolutely. So I've got two questions for you, and I'm also going to share this. Before I do that, just share a quick comment from Maria. She says, I like cameras on. It makes you feel that everyone's actually there, kind of in the same terms, but it's weird seeing yourself, which in face-to-face situations you don't. Yes. I understand now this could be very uncomfortable for some people. Also, sometimes it's distracting to see the different backgrounds or have everyone in front of you. I think that she makes really good points there. But I think ultimately we do feel more connected when we see each other. I mean, I can't believe the difference when we said, please turn your cameras on, and all these lovely faces and smiles started coming on the screen, and we suddenly felt like we weren't just talking to a blank screen anymore. Any more comments or questions, please pop them in the chat. So I've got sort of two things to ask you about. The first one is, I think it doesn't matter what your role is. We all experience this sometimes, where we want to delegate something, but it takes more time to delegate it. And also you might have to end up doing it again yourself, or so you just think, do you know what, I'm just going to add that to my pile. So that's the first thing I'd like you to share your experience on. How do you get past that mindset of, because ultimately you're never going to engage people, they will never improve their skills. So because we've become very accustomed to a short-term gain mindset. And we live in such a fast-paced world now, where I'll just add that, I'll quickly do that, I'll do that on the train. You see people now working in these tiny nooks and crevices of their days. So how do we get past that?
Well, I think that it is something that you really have to overcome, because yes, the atmosphere is pressurised. It will always be pressurised. In fact, looking back over my career, I sound like some old biddy or something, but looking back over my career, I can't think of a single job that I've done where I haven't been pressurised. So if you just take it as a given that you're going to be operating in a highly charged environment, I think that's the starting point. So it then becomes a question of, what do you see your role as? If you see your role as simply being there for a period of time, demonstrating that you've done wonderfully, and then skipping off into the sunset, that might work in the short term, but it isn't going to be a long-term solution to your achieving whatever the goals are that you set yourself. I personally realised in my career that I needed to make investments. I needed to invest in myself. So yes, I'd say that I am very hardworking, that I really do expect a lot of myself. But in addition to making the investment in myself, I see it as important, equally as important, if not more so, that I invest in my colleagues. By which I mean, if they have a skill that I can see shows great potential, I've got a responsibility to do what I can to assist them. Equally, if they're not necessarily well suited to the particular task that they've been asked to perform, I've got a responsibility to help them see perhaps how they can address any shortcomings. And if they can't, I've got a responsibility to identify the square peg for the square person, So So I see it as a win-win situation. So whilst, yes, you're right, in the short term, the temptation might be to say, oh, just give it to me, I will do it. Far better to just take that extra time, sit down with the person, explain very clearly what it is that needs to be done, make sure you have, you know, reviews, regular reviews to check that they're doing okay, that things are on track, and if they're not, make sure you take the time to sit with them, and that way you do make an investment in the future, because the next time you won't have to sit down with them. So it's recognizing that that's the case. And I have, and those of you who are in positions of being able to recruit people, I can think of all sorts of examples where I've engaged people, I've recruited them, and I've seen their potential. You know, they may not be the bright, shiny, finished article, but I can see, yes, that person has really great potential, and I've brought them in, and either I've helped them or I've put them in touch with others, and then you see them fly, and it's great.
I love that shift, and I think that sometimes this is all about gaining a new perspective on things, isn't it? So we're still doing the same, we're still delegating tasks, but we're actually thinking of it as investing in them as individuals, but also investing in the growth of the team that you're working in, and investing in the organisation. But I do think the ego gets in the way a little bit sometimes, doesn't it?
It does.
And it can be, it can really be overwhelming sometimes to think about it in a positive way and just think, oh, I'll just quickly do this. So I think that was a little piece of gold that you shared. Thinking about it as investing in that person rather than seeing it as something negative, something that's time negative. See it as, yes, it's going to take a little bit of time, but actually it's an investment of time for both me, them, and the organisation. I'm just going to share a quick comment here from Holly. She said, hugely agree with the short-term gain being seen in many offices. The amount of time I talk about short-term pain versus long-term gain with colleagues, about putting in the time now to make everyone's lives easier. I also apply this to my own home life with my children by putting in the effort now, teaching them the skills they need, so they have them forever. That's not to say I don't have an off day every now and then. Yeah, we're only aiming for 80%, Holly, because we're human beings at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
So just in the interest of time, because I feel like we could talk about this all day, Wendy, but I'm sure you've got lots of important things to get back to. So if we just sort of carry on for maybe another 10 minutes or so, if you've got any questions, please, now is the time to put them in the chat. Or any other comments. The second thing I wanted to ask you about was really, I think it'd be helpful. We always try to sort of bring the conversations towards an end with some really practical things. So we have these high level conversations. We know all of this is important, but practically, what can those people who are joining or perhaps listening to this later on, what can we do given the new way of work? Well, it's not very new anymore, but it still feels like it's testing us in some ways. What tools or what tips could you share for how do you actually ensure really effective collaboration across a team?
I think that just recognising that you are, yes, I'm sure everyone as an individual is really talented, but I can certainly say I'm not the finished article, and Lord knows I'm still going, and I've been working for hundreds of years. So the point being that once you recognise that you have an important contribution to make, but it is a contribution and it is not the only contribution to make, and once you make that realisation, then the next stage is to support others, because if you're going to succeed, you can't do it alone. If you're prepared to put yourself out for colleagues, yes, of course you will find some occasions where some people just sort of skim the crest of the wave, take take all of your work and then sort of, use it for their own ends. But I think that's less common. I think it's far more common that people want to help. They want to help you. They want to help in the endeavour. So I think some of the tips, if you like, are just to be prepared to be selfless, be prepared not to be selfish, and be prepared to keep sight of what it is that needs to be achieved. And I think what comes into that is what's helped me over the years is the increasing ability not to take things too personally, by which I mean in any team, there will be stars, there will be fantastic people. There may be one or two people who aren't necessarily on the same page, but if you can find a way to work with all of the members of the team and to recognise that, okay, I may not see eye to eye with so-and-so on this particular matter, but when it comes to such and such, they are absolutely on the money, and so I can engage with them on that level. If you can find a way to work with everyone, no matter what their weird and wonderful ways and behaviours, then I think that helps you as the individual, and it also helps you overcome any of the challenges that you might face.
Absolutely. And I think also what you said earlier on in the conversation about whatever, I think, to do with the modality or the communication channel, just being really clear about your expectations for that and why that's important.
And also being authentic, because I've done roles. For example, I inspect the police and I inspect the fire service. I've never been a police officer, I've never been a firefighter. So if I'd gone into the role thinking I know all there is to know about policing, because I've been a prosecutor, that would have been not only arrogant, but also completely erroneous. So there's something about having the humility to recognise that you don't know it all, that you've actually probably got quite a lot that you need to get on top of, so that you can make the informed decisions and the informed judgments. So it's be authentic. I'm not a neuroscientist, so don't pretend to be a neuroscientist. These are the skills that I have, and I think I'm becoming increasingly clear about the skills that I do have, but I'm also sufficiently humble to recognise that these are the skills that I don't. But just because I don't have the skill doesn't mean I can't learn it. So,
absolutely.
Be open to having your whole way of thinking, having your mind opened, and to be open to new experiences.
Absolutely. Oh, so many great things there, Wendy. I think we've got a question here from Keith. He said, how did you adapt your leadership of your home organisation while you were doing the Windrush inquiry, and how did you adapt again when you came back?
Well, that was actually quite a challenge. That's a really good question, actually. that was quite a challenge, because don't forget I was doing the two roles alongside each other. And the culture in the inspectorate was very different to the culture in the Home Office. The inspectorate was much smaller, and I was one of the senior people in the organisation, so hopefully I contributed to really positive working environment and culture. The culture in the Home Office was mixed, depending on, because it's huge, 38,000 people with lots of different directorates. But the culture was more diffuse, and also one had to remember that I had been asked to review something that had gone wrong. So so there was a degree of apprehension, understandably, about me as an individual. What was I like? Was I going in with some preconceived agenda? So in terms of adapting, if anything, and it does come back to being authentic, I was myself, and I didn't try to be anything other than myself. I had it was a real privilege to be asked to do it. I met some fantastic members of staff who I would have, snaffled if I'd had half a chance. I met some fantastic senior officials. I met some great people who'd been affected. So what I tried to do was use those experiences to just keep it rooted, keep everything rooted in, what are we here to do? What do we need to achieve? What do I need to try to do that? And I think that, who knows, but I think that by being open, and by being open to whatever it was that people wanted to tell me, that despite the fact that I saw some aspects, some cultural aspects that I wasn't happy with, I saw the review as a means of hopefully identifying some of the potential solutions to address that. So turning it into, what could I do practically to address some of the issues, rather than being caught up in any sort of vortex.
Absolutely. So we've got Patricia, who's just said, great reminder that as leaders we don't know everything, and sometimes we are the weird and wonderful person in the team.
Yes. I've been that person, and I've employed that person on occasions.
It's such an interesting topic to talk about, because I think it's one of the things that we see within the sort of well-being side of the world now is that loneliness is creeping up and up and up. So just to sort of one final thought from you, Wendy, before we end this, how can we, regardless of our position, whether we're leaders or not, how can we help teams and our people that we work, our colleagues, to feel less lonely and more connected, so we can really foster those strong collaborative ways of working? What's your sort of final thoughts?
I see engaging with the team as a muscle that you've just got to keep exercising. So it would be really easy for me, if I wanted to, never to engage with my team. It would be really, really easy. I could say, oh, I've got all these inspections, can't possibly take time, can't make time for that. But I think if you are really serious about wanting to get the best out of your team, if you're really serious about wanting to achieve the best possible outcomes for the public you serve, it starts right here. So it's about that self-discipline. It's about making sure that you carve out the time to engage with perhaps the member of the team who is less vocal, equally to engage with the member of the team who might seem to be outwardly quite garrulous, but who themselves might be dealing with issues. And if you take the time and the trouble to establish that rapport with the person, whether they're very different to you, whether they're similar to you, it really doesn't matter, then you get something out of it, and hopefully so do they. And hopefully what they see is that you actually care.
Absolutely.
Because if people recognise that, boy, there's nothing they won't do to support you.
Absolutely. And I think it's a little bit like the analogy of, when you've done your homework and your teacher doesn't check it,
yes,
and you just think, well, I'm not going to bother doing that next time. And I see this quite often in teams where the one-to-one keeps getting moved, or the weekly meeting or those catch-ups are really just very focused on tasks and outcomes and not on
if they happen at all.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that is a superb second piece of gold, Wendy, to leave everybody with. I think that's all we've got time for. Any final comments, please feel free to pop them in the chat. It's almost 11:30 on Wednesday the 19th of July, so I'd just like to extend a huge thank you again to you, Wendy. I mean, I know you're incredibly busy, and we really feel very honoured to have had you in with us today at Civil Service College. And also to you, those of you who are joining live, I really, really want to thank you as well, because giving an hour of your time at any point in our lives feels like a huge investment, and that's I really hope that you got something out of it, and you see value, and you can go away and take some of this information back to your colleagues and hopefully be collaborating more effectively. And if you have any topics that you'd like to see in conversation with, I'll just pop my email in the chat. Please send me an email, because I'm just now looking at topics for the autumn and then 2024, which is absolutely around the corner. But anyway, thank you again, and wish you a lovely rest of your Wednesday, and please do join us next time.
Thanks
again.
Thank you.